Welcome back, you all. In our previous tutorial, we looked at the mouse over and mouse out events, right, which allow us to create an interaction for hovering from JavaScript. And we also learned how to place elements in a circle using HTML, right? So we created this silly little composition where whenever we hover over the square, a new element gets added to the circle around that. In this tutorial, we're going to continue building on top of this code, and we're going to start looking at timers, right? JavaScript has two main functions for working with time, and we're going to get into those. And then we're also going to look at the marquee HTML element, which is a deprecated but really fun element, which allows you to have moving text on a page, kind of like in the bottom of the TV news channel. Great. So yeah, we're continuing with the same code from the previous tutorial. And the first change that I want to make, let's make it such that whenever the page loads, it waits for 5 seconds, and after those 5 seconds, say it changes the color of the square in the middle from yellow to green, right? So we need to find a way to somehow tell JavaScript to wait for 5 seconds. And one, or like the main way of doing that is using the set timeout function. And set timeout does exactly what it sounds like, right? It takes a parameter which is a function, which is what will get executed after a certain amount of time, and then it takes a number, which is the amount of time that we want JavaScript to wait before executing that function. For the function, we'll just call it on timeout, and then we have to declare it like we do for all of the event listeners. And then we have to give it a number, which is the actual time that it should wait. And that number needs to be in milliseconds. So 5 seconds is equal to 5,000 milliseconds. And now we need to declare our function. So let's say function on timeout. And at first, let's print something to the console to figure out if the function is getting executed. So console.log, it has been 5 seconds since the page loaded. Let's clear out the console and refresh and wait for 5 seconds. Okay, so it has been 5 seconds since the page loaded. Right, if we were to make it 1 second, so 1000, we would see it appearing way quicker. It still says 5 seconds, but you get the point, right? So set timeout is one easy way of dealing with time in JavaScript. If you want to have an interaction where the user is doing something, but then the response from your web page is only coming a few seconds later, or even a few minutes or hours later, set timeout is the way to go. And now, yeah, let's change the color of our square from yellow to green. So I will get the element, right? So we'll say var center element equals document get element by ID center. Remember, we can't use this center element in the new function because each variable is sort of limited. Its existence is limited to the function that it was declared in, right? That's called scoping in JavaScript. And yeah, if you declare a variable inside of a function, it only exists in there. If you declare a variable inside of an if statement, it only exists inside of that if statement. And if you declare a variable outside of everything, that's called a global variable, and that can be accessed from everywhere. That's sort of a simple way of explaining scoping. So we get our center element, and then we say center element dot style for background color equals green. All right, and I'm gonna change it back to 5 seconds, and let's test it here. Let's refresh the page and wait for 5 seconds, and it turned green. So that means our timer is working. So that's sort of the simplest timer that can be used in JavaScript. there is one other function that I'm going to show you that's very similar or like almost identical in the way of usage to set timeout. This new function is called set interval. And the difference between set timeout and set interval is that set interval is going to fire multiple times, right? If we set an interval for 2 seconds, then every 2 seconds from now on until we stop the interval, our function is going to get called, right? So let's create one and let's make it fire every 2 seconds. So we'll just say on interval, and then I'll have it be for 2 seconds as I was mentioning. And let's declare the on interval function. And for now, I'm just going to print to the console. And let's keep an eye on the console. And we should, right, so we're seeing 2, 3. We see this number increasing, which means that our function is getting called and things are being printed to the console. So I was thinking that one way we could change the code from our previous tutorial is to have our squares, the ones that appear around our main square on the hover interaction, to have them appear on the interval, right? So have them appear kind of automatically and build the spiral that we were using earlier. And in order to do that, we need to sort of rearrange our code a little bit. We have this on mouse over function, which does the interaction of making a new square appear on screen. We could totally separate things a little bit, and the piece of code which actually adds a new square, we could create a new function that just does that, and then call that new function from on mouse over, but also from inside our interval. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to create a new function. So I'll just say function create new square. And I'm going to cut and paste the contents from on mouse over from here, from line 13, where it says var new element equals document create element div, right? Like that's the part that creates our squares around the main one, right? So I'm going to paste it in the create new square. Maybe I'm going to even remove these comments at the end. And now let's call our create new square function from inside on mouse over, just to make sure that the code is still working, right? So we'll say create new square. Okay, so it's still doing what it was doing earlier. Right, and the reason we did this is because we want to use the same piece of code, right? The same uh, logic that's creating a new square in multiple different places. And that's in general one thing that programmers do, right? They kind of compartmentalize pieces of code that need to be used in multiple places into functions in our case, or into other entities in other cases, and try to reuse those as efficiently as possible without having to copy and paste code from one place to another, or get messy. So right now, if we just called our create new square function inside of on interval, we should start seeing squares appearing every 2 seconds. Right, so our page is slowly getting filled up with the circle that we were working on. If we made the interval shorter, right, like if we made it instead of 2 seconds, let's say 500 milliseconds, then that should happen a lot quicker, right? Like now the speed is 2 squares a second. We could make it even quicker. We could make it 100 milliseconds, right? And now it's happening even faster, right? So it just keeps going, keeps creating this spiral looking composition. So yeah, maybe let's keep it at 100 milliseconds for now, And the other thing that I kind of want to do, I kind of want to make this whole thing rotate. And that would be an animation of sorts, right? Like I want a smooth animation of it rotating around in a circle. And that's one other thing that can be achieved with set interval, right? Like if the interval is small enough, right now it's 100 milliseconds. If we bring it down even lower to maybe 30 milliseconds, that means that there are 30 milliseconds, there would be like around 30 function calls in each second, which basically means 30 frames per second, right? And like that's the frame rates of many of the movies and videos and animations that we see. And it's often 24 frames per second or 30 or 60. Those are kind of the defaults. But for our animation, we'll be happy with something that's roughly around 30. Um, and in order to achieve the actual rotation, we're going to use the CSS transform property that we've discussed before, right? And the transform has a rotate attribute which can be used in order to rotate various elements on the page. And we're actually going to apply that directly to the body. So let's just do a prototype at first. If we just say transform rotate and then 45 degrees, we see our composition is rotated by 45 degrees, right? If we gave it 25 degrees, it's a different kind of rotation. So what we want to do is at every frame, right? So every 30 milliseconds, increase this rotation by a little bit, right? Maybe by half a degree or by 1 degree. And then as the function keeps executing, our body and our composition would rotate around. So I'm going to actually start it at 0. And in order to keep track of this rotation, I'm going to create a global variable, right? And I'm going to call it body rotation in degrees, and this is going to start as 0. And now let us create a new interval. So we'll say set interval, and we can just call it rotate body and call it every 30 milliseconds. Let's create the function rotate body. Okay, so we need to do two things here. We need to increase that variable, which is the rotation angle, by a little bit, and then maybe we can just see the speed of rotation and adjust if we want to increase it by more or by less. And then we need to actually apply that rotation to the body element from JavaScript, right? So what did we call the variable? It's body rotation degrees. I'm just going to increase it by 0.25 at first, right? It's 30 frames a second, which means, oh my god, I'm so bad at math. 6 degrees a second maybe, which is not too much, not too little. So body rotation degrees plus 0.25. And now we need to apply this to the body style. So we can just say document.body.style for the transform property equals to, and then rotate, open parenthesis, plus our body rotation degrees, plus close parenthesis. We forgot the degrees, the unit of measurement. Okay, so now we see that, I'm just going to switch over to the new one. We see that our body actually starts rotating. You see these scroll bars are kind of going crazy, and I think that's just because of the size of the window and of the body itself. But it's pretty much what I had in mind for this. All right, so now maybe we could make the squares appear even quicker. Let's bump this down to, let's say, 50 to make them happen even quicker. Great. And one other thing we could do is, let's say, adding a button which stops the rotation, right? Like if we wanted the user to be able to control whether the body is rotating or not. we could add a button and stop that interval. So let's do that. Let's create a button on the body. So I'll just say button ID equals stop rotation, and the text is going to be stop rotation. You see that's also moving with the body, which is it might make it hard to click, but that's okay. And inside of JavaScript, we'll just say var stop rotation button. We'll just get it by ID, right? So document get element by ID, and the ID was stop rotation. Right, and then we'll add an event listener for click. So we'll just say stop rotation, add event listener, and then we need to create the function. We'll just call it stop rotation on stop rotation click. Okay, so let's say function on stop rotation click. Okay, so we want to stop our body from rotating, which means that we need to somehow cancel this interval that we've created. And JavaScript offers us the function that's called clear interval, right? Clear interval, which stops an interval from executing, right? So once you call this, it doesn't fire anymore every 2 seconds. However, this function needs the interval ID of the interval that it should stop, right? Like, even in our case, we have 2 intervals set up, so it needs to know which one of the 2 it has to stop. In order to do that, we can assign this like set interval. When this function is being called, it returns an interval ID, right? Like if we were to do, oops, not here, here. Let's say var interval ID equals set interval, and then if we were to print the interval ID, oh, we're getting an error because I misspelled the variable. It's stop rotation button instead of stop rotation. Okay, and oh, we've also forgot to tell the event listener what event to listen to, and that's going to be the click event. Okay, so this number, the number 4, let's write the message as well. So interval ID is, right, we get a number, which is sort of like the internal JavaScript ID for this interval. So we somehow need to pass this interval ID from this function into this other function, right, to be able to pass it to the clear interval call. And the way to do that is by turning it into a global variable, right? So if at the very top we declare var interval ID equals 0, and then in here, instead of declaring it again with var, we just assign the value of the interval ID to the variable, right? And then we just say clear interval for the interval ID. Now, when we click the button, which we might have to wait for, because right now it's gone. Okay, in that case, maybe I will move the button closer to the center of the page. Oh, there we go. Right, so I just clicked the button and the rotation stopped. I'm going to actually move that button closer to the center of the page so that it's always visible. For that, I'm going to give it a class stop rotation button, and in the CSS we can just say stop rotation button. We can just say left 30%, top 30%, and position fixed. Right, so that should bring it a little bit closer to the center. Right, so now when I hit stop rotation, everything stops where it is. And if we wanted to restart the rotation, we would sort of have to create a new interval, right? So call set interval for rotate body with 30 once again in order for that to happen. All right, great. That's it with timers and intervals in JavaScript. They're pretty easy to use, right? It's just set timeout for calling it once, set interval for an infinite number of times until you cancel it. And the last thing that I wanted to show is making text move. I'm actually going to increase this interval to 150 for placing squares. Making text move, one of you had asked in class how you can do that. And there is a really easy way, which is the HTML marquee element. So it's called marquee, and we can just type some text inside and say this is a piece of moving text. We can't see anything right now because I think the text is black and the button is also black. Oh, there we go, it's there. It doesn't like the body rotating, so maybe I will disable that for now. Let's also change the color of the text first. So we'll just say class equals marquee text. And let's go in our style and say marquee text color yellow. Right, so we see it over there, it's like sort of struggling to move through the body because we're rotating the entire container, and that's not, it kind of goes against what it wants to do. So I'm actually going to disable the rotation for now. Right, so we just have the elements appearing, and then we have our piece of moving text, which is moving on our screen from left to right. You can, there are a few attributes of this marquee object. If you're interested in learning more about it, just look it up because there's good documentation for it, especially on the Mozilla website. It says here that it's deprecated, which means that it used to be quite popular in the web. Right now it's not necessarily fully supported anymore, so it might not work in some browsers. And in the future, support is going to get less and less and less prevalent. But for now, if you're interested in it, you can totally use it. The one attribute that I'm going to show is the direction attribute. So if we say direction equals up, then our text is going to move from bottom to top. Here we see the container is a little bit strange, and I think there is a way to adjust that container. I haven't really worked with this before, so I'm not fully sure how that container. Oh, I see. I assume it's just the width and the height of the marquee element. That's so if we give it a height of 1,000, it should come from all the way at the bottom, right? And then it keeps coming up, and then I assume it's the same. I'm going to remove the height attribute for now. I assume it's the same. We should do direction right, where it moves in the opposite direction from before, and then down would be a thing as well. Okay, great. So in terms, yeah, I think we should do one more thing to complete the chaos that this glitch page is turning into, and that would be just adding a lot of pieces of moving text. And in order to do that, we can maybe create a new interval and add a new piece of moving text at the interval. So let's say set interval, add new piece of text, and that's a function that we'll have to create, and we can do it every, let's say, 200 milliseconds. So I'll just say function add new piece of text, And in here, what we want to do is to create an HTML element, which is of the marquee type, add it to the body, make sure to set its style, right, its color to yellow, and place some content inside of it. Great, so let's do that. Var marquee element equals document create element, and I said we want the marquee. We want the marquee element style for background color to be yellow. We want to add some content to it, right? So we can say marquee element.inner HTML equals, this is some more moving text, and we want to add it to the body, and that would be document.body.append child for marquee element. Okay, oh, I said the background color instead of the text color, but actually I think I like that more. Wow, this is so chaotic. Oh my god, this is so much. Okay, and one other thing we should do, see right now HTML or like JavaScript keeps adding and adding and adding and adding to the page, and the page is just going to keep growing and become slower. One thing we could do, we could maybe tell that interval to stop after we've added, I don't know, 30, 40 of them. We could do that kind of by keeping track of how many we've added, how many times the interval has fired, and having an if statement that calls clear interval afterwards. But I'm not going to do that right now. Yeah, this is kind of interesting. Um, yeah, our crazy blue sun and the moving text. Um, yeah, I think I'm going to stop here with this tutorial. It definitely got a little bit out of hand, but I'm into what's happening here. As usual, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And yeah, thank you for listening.